Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second of the series of History and Heritage lectures. Dr. Catriona Mackie needs no introduction from me at all. You're very welcome. Catriona is going to talk to us about tenants and landlords in the Scottish Hebrides.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good evening, everybody. From the late 18th century onwards, the living conditions of the rural population in Britain and Ireland became an increasing concern for social reformers, who bemoaned the overcrowded dwellings, the lack of sanitation, and the presence of animals in the house. Reformers were particularly concerned about the effect of poor housing on human welfare, as it was assumed that a poor home environment would inevitably lead to a variety of social ills, such as poor health, indolence, ignorance, and worst of all, immorality. Until the late 19th century, rural housing reforms were addressed by individual landowners who sought to improve the condition of their tenants by providing or encouraging improved tenant housing. An important aspect of rural housing reform involved the introduction of various types of physical segregation. These included the segregation of people from animals, the clean from the foul, the working environment from the domestic sphere, and the separation of male and female roles and sleeping spaces. In my paper this evening, I'd like to examine the importance that was attached to issues of segregation in the drive to improve tenant housing in the Isle of Lewis, and to consider the reasons why attempts at housing reform during this period were generally unsuccessful. The Isle of Lewis is the most northerly of the Scottish Hebrides. The island was and still is predominantly rural, with tenants in the 19th century earning a living mainly from the land, growing crops and keeping small numbers of sheep and cattle, as well as engaging in a little bit of fishing. Much of the physical data that I'll be discussing tonight comes from the township of Braga on the west coast of the island. The early 19th century settlements in Braga and elsewhere in Lewis comprised small clusters of dwellings situated around the coast and around the many sea lochs. During the course of the 19th century, the settlements in Lewis were moved a number of times under successive landowners, with the result that 5 distinct phases of house building can be identified on the ground, dating from the early 19th to the early 20th centuries. When this is combined with a substantial body of documentary and oral evidence, we're left with a significant resource with which we can examine rural housing reform and the conflicted relationship that existed between tenants and landowners. By the mid-19th century, the issue of housing the working classes had become the focus of numerous investigations and reports, which were commissioned to examine the welfare and sanitary conditions of the urban and rural poor. Many houses were found to have insufficient bedroom accommodation. Most houses had only 1 or 2 rooms, and inadequate drainage and sanitary arrangements. Contemporary commentators blamed the inadequate housing conditions for the poor physical, social, economic, moral and intellectual state of the tenant population. Overcrowded and squalid living conditions were widely blamed for driving men to drink, and therefore irresponsibility and violence. Young girls would be hindered in their domestic development and would grow up to be inadequate housewives. Even more worrying, living in 1 or 2 rooms often meant that children of the opposite sexes slept in the same room and frequently in the same bed. The prevailing attitudes are summed up by the Reverend James Fraser in the 1867 report into the employment of women and children in agriculture. James Fraser writes, "The moral consequences are fearful to contemplate. Modesty must be an unknown virtue, decency an unimaginable thing, where, in one small chamber, father, mother, young lads, men, grown and growing up girls, 2 or sometimes 3 generations, are herded promiscuously, where every operation of the toilette and of nature, dressings, undressings, births, deaths, is performed by each within sight or hearing of all, where children of both sexes, to as high an age as 12 or 14, or even more, occupy the same bed, where the whole atmosphere is sensual, and human nature is degraded into something below the level of the swine." Such dire consequences were broadly assumed to apply to all tenants living in such circumstances. It was simply inconceivable that anybody living in these conditions could be a moral and upstanding citizen. Lord Francis Napier commented to the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes in 1884 that if the people in the Highlands and Islands are on the whole healthy and moral, it is in spite of the condition of their dwellings, and in consequence of certain counteracting influences in their lives. And if they had better dwellings, one of the natural impediments to health and to morality would be removed. If they had better dwellings, we may presume that they might be more healthy and more moral. Living conditions were also considered to reflect the social status and degree of refinement of the occupants. As late as 1904, it was stated that it is generally conceded that the dwellings of a people form a reliable index to the state of civilization. To improve one would therefore mean to improve the other. Lord Napier, for example, believed that social progress could not be achieved without improved housing, which he saw as an inseparable concomitant of all other improvements. Now, while the problem of improved housing was recognised throughout the British Isles, it was left to individual landowners to choose whether or not to provide accommodation for their workforce. On some estates, various means were used to encourage tenants to adapt and improve their dwellings, or to replace them with new improved houses. A few landowners even went as far as building better houses for their tenants and labourers. But attempts by landowners to improve housing conditions often met with resistance from the tenants. One English author commented that he had often bitterly experienced that the extra room provided is only regarded in the light of a potato store or of lodger accommodation. The family still pigs together in the remaining sleeping space in the plea that numbers supply that warmth which the expense of a coal fire denies. There's substantial documentary evidence to suggest that the improvements that the landowners deemed important weren't necessarily valued to the same extent by the tenants, who frequently resisted attempts to improve their housing. And this difference in values wasn't simply the result of poverty. Contemporary descriptions of the houses of even relatively wealthy tenants in Scotland and Ireland also indicate a lack of improved features. For example, the house of a farmer in County Mayo, who possessed 100 head of cattle and 200 sheep, was found in 1813 to have not a single chair or stool, but one three-legged one, no bed but rushes, no vessel for boiling their meals but one, nor any for drinking milk out of but one. Satisfied with little themselves, they seek not what others would call comforts, but which, to them, by habit, would be superfluous luxuries. Hence, in their houses, there is little of cleanliness or apparent comfort in furniture, bedding, or the usual accompaniment of a certain sum of riches. Many landowners felt that it was their duty to improve the living conditions of their tenants, and they saw the restructuring of domestic space as a powerful means of imposing new values and new ways of living onto what they considered to be a backward population. That the tenants themselves didn't want to improve in this way was irrelevant, because it was widely accepted that civilised people had an obligation to help those who were too ignorant to help themselves. At the heart of the matter was the unyielding belief of the higher classes in the superiority of their own ideals, which included a responsibility to encourage advancement in those less fortunate than themselves. When the Halifax Building Society began promoting the purchase of cottages at Edward Ackroyd's model village of Ackroydon in Halifax, it was to improve the home of the working man, and by improving his home, to improve his health, his habits, his tastes, and his character, and altogether to raise him in the social scale. This was the case in Lewis during the 19th century, when a succession of landowners attempted to induce the island's tenants to improve their houses. As in other parts of the British Isles, the Lewis tenants strongly resisted such improvements, and in fact in Lewis we see the most sustained resistance to housing reform of anywhere in the British Isles. But before we go on to discuss some of these reforms, I'd like to introduce you to the houses as they were at the beginning of the 19th century. In Lewis, the houses weren't provided by the landowner. Instead, they were built by the people who lived in them, using locally available materials such as stone, turf, clay and thatch. They normally comprised 3 and sometimes 4 basic units. The largest of these was the byre dwelling unit, which contained the living area and the byre, housing both humans and cattle under the same roof. The houses were usually built on a slope, with the byre in the lower end to allow for the drainage of liquid manure through a small hole in the end wall of the byre away from the living area. At this time, the cattle would have taken up around 2/3 of the byre dwelling unit. The cattle were housed indoors over the winter, and the manure was left to accumulate until the spring, when the cattle went to the summer pasture. The manure was then taken from the house and spread on the potatoes as fertiliser. There was no effective partition between the 2 ends of the house. Reports from the mid-19th century suggest that in many houses, the only thing separating the byre from the living area was a row of stones 6 to 8 inches high. The byre dwelling was flanked by a porch on one side and a barn on the other. Entry to the byre dwelling unit was through the porch. Both cattle and humans used the same door, which was situated at the byre end of the house, often at the lower end, which meant that the inhabitants sometimes had to walk the full length of the byre to reach the living area. The barn was also entered from the byre and was used for storing food and fodder, as well as for threshing grain. Some houses had an additional unit, the upper room, which was entered from the living area and could be used for storage and for extra sleeping space. The hearth sat on the floor in the middle of the living area. There were no windows or chimneys in these houses. Instead, there was often a small hole or two in the base of the thatched roof to let out some of the smoke and to let in some of the light. The smoke was allowed to seep out through the thatch, which was removed once a year and spread on the potatoes. You can see then that the form and fabric of the house were intimately connected to the agricultural cycle, with the accumulation of manure in the byre and the annual removal of the thatch, both of which were vitally important sources of fertiliser. The earliest attempts to encourage tenants in Lewis to improve their houses are found in a set of estate regulations dating to around 1825. They were probably compiled by the then proprietor, James Alexander Stewart Mackenzie. Article 10 of the regulations states that every house should have 2 doors, one for the tenants and one for the cattle, and a partition between the byre and the living area. According to the Minister of Stornoway at the time, these changes were, and I quote, sorely against the will of the people. And generally speaking, Mackenzie's stipulations for housing improvement were completely ignored. Throughout the course of the 19th century, the segregation of cattle from the human occupants of the house was a recurrent theme in Lewis estate regulations. The fact that it continually reappears attests to the strength and resilience of the byre dwelling tradition on the island. Cattle were an important asset in Lewis society, and keeping them indoors was undoubtedly the easiest way to keep a close eye on them, while also ensuring a convenient supply of milk and fertiliser. It was thought that the people would benefit from the heat generated by the cattle over the winter, and the cattle would benefit from the heat of the open hearth. But the relationship between Lewis tenants and their cattle was more than just pragmatic. One 19th century writer commented that they say the cows like to have their company and see the fire, and as these are their great mainstay, they pet them accordingly, spoil them with fish bones for sweetmeats, and treat them with great familiarity. From the landowner's perspective, the importance of segregating cattle from humans was no doubt partly due to concerns about health and sanitation. But this was reinforced by the belief that the animals were lesser creatures and that living with the animals was incompatible with civilised behaviour. Fullerton's Gazetteer of Scotland described the Lewis tenants in 1842, noting that good management of any kind is not to be expected from people whose domestic habits are so barbarous. In 1844, the Isle of Lewis was purchased by James Matheson. Matheson was from Sutherland in the north of Scotland, and he had recently returned to Britain after making his fortune in the east trading in opium. Like Stuart Mackenzie before him, Matheson's attempts to improve housing in Lewis involved the creation of estate regulations, printed in 1849, which set the standards to which all new houses must be built. In addition to a partition between the byre and the living area and a separate entrance for the cattle, Matheson stipulated that there should also be separate sleeping spaces for the unmarried men and women. Once again, improvement was resisted, despite Matheson's offer of leases for those tenants who complied with the no less than 54 stipulated regulations. One old man commented wryly that he couldn't keep 10 commandments for a mansion in the sky, much less for a black house in Lewis. The importance given to separate sleeping spaces for the sexes shows clearly the cultural differences between the proprietor and his tenants. According to Matheson and other reforming landlords, the two sexes sharing a sleeping space would inevitably lead to immorality. But there was no evidence that this was the case in Lewis, where strong social and cultural constraints were in place to prevent such abuses. In fact, the percentage of illegitimate births in rural Lewis during the late 19th century was the lowest in the whole of Scotland. Matheson was also highly critical of the traditional gender roles on the island. Women did much of the heavy work on the croft, and at times could be seen hard at work while the men were resting. A report by the Highland Relief Board in 1849 stated that the females seemed no better than slaves, working hard at outdoor labour, carrying manure on creels on their backs, and doing work which is elsewhere that of the lower animal. These types of opinions about the role of men and women in Lewis society clearly reflect wider cultural differences between the islanders and people from outside the island. Men's work and women's work were clearly delineated in Lewis society, with each sex having their own areas of expertise, and it was considered taboo for men to engage in women's work and vice versa. So while the male and female roles of Lewis tenants were segregated by their own traditions, this segregation differed greatly from that found among the middle and upper classes, where a woman's place was deemed to be in the home, not out in the field. To outsiders such as Matheson, the traditional practices were considered to be uncivilised, and it was this negative view of the tenant way of life that prompted Matheson to try and improve their condition. The segregation of the sexes, both while sleeping and in their daily roles, was seen as one of the means by which tenants could rise above their circumstances and become members of a more civilised society. In 1879, a year after James Matheson's death, a second set of estate regulations was published in his name. These went even further and stipulated that all houses should have at least 2 compartments, a living area and a sleeping area, with a window in the wall of each, and that there should be a chimney or some other method of smoke extraction. The thatch was not to be stripped from the roof and used as fertiliser, and the manure was to be removed from the byre on a regular basis to a dung heap outside. Once again, tenants resisted. What you see here is a plan produced by Matheson as a model for tenant housing in Lewis. The byre is separate from the dwelling, and there's also a separate dung stead. The house is divided into a kitchen, a parlour cum bedroom and a closet with a small entrance hall. There's a chimney at either end of the house and windows at the front and back. As far as I'm aware, none of these houses were ever built, presumably because tenants were expected to build them themselves. In 1885, the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes astutely observed that James Matheson's provision for housing improvement in Lewis amounted to nothing more than a gracious permission to the tenants to build themselves a house at their own expense. In 1889, under the Local Government Scotland Act, local administration was taken out of the hands of the landed gentry and given to the newly elected county councils. To begin with, the local authorities had no more success in encouraging housing reform than Matheson or Mackenzie before them. One of the tasks that was set by the Lewis District Committee was the abolition of the byre dwelling. So, in 1893, the committee decreed that, under the threat of a summons from the sheriff, a stone partition wall reaching the roof must be built between the byre and the living area, with no means of intercommunication between them. Tenants were also ordered to create a chimney flue in this new partition wall and to insert a glazed window in the front wall of the living area. But yet again, these orders were ignored by the tenants and were never successfully implemented by the committee, who had neither the staff nor the money, nor possibly the will, to go against the tenants' wishes in this matter. The failure of the Lewis District Committee to effectively enforce its legislation was probably the result of a number of factors. First of all, Lewis was extremely overcrowded. The population of the island increased steadily throughout the 19th century, from just over 9,000 in 1801 to nearly 29,000 in 1901. The rising population had led to a shortage of land, and many tenants resorted to subdividing their lots in order to give part of their land to a family member. Some tenants also built houses illegally on the edge of the common grazing land. Efforts to deal with substandard housing were therefore complicated by the size of the tenant population, the scarcity of land on which to build new houses, and the fact that a significant number of Lewis tenants didn't actually pay any rent to the proprietor. In addition to this, the local administration at the time was extremely weak. The chief medical officer lived in Dingwall on the east coast of the Scottish mainland, and his assistant in Lewis was apparently incapacitated by age from much active service. The Lewis District Committee had no funds to employ a dedicated medical officer for the island, nor did they have the funds to provide additional support for the sanitation inspector. As the tenants had resisted improvements in the past, it's also quite likely that the committee were concerned that attempting to force the issue might result in a recurrence of the land agitations that had spread throughout the Hebrides in the 1880s. In 1892, the Board of Supervision recognised the quite exceptional difficulties involved in legislating for improved housing, noting that the people, as a rule, are satisfied with and even attached to their miserable hovels, and it is impossible to change in a day the confirmed habits of a whole people. Nor, so far as the board are aware, can it be said that the public health or moral tone of these remote communities suffers in any appreciable degree from the want of better accommodation. The islanders in general are a hardy race, and epidemic diseases cannot be said to be more generally prevalent in the islands than in other parts of the country. The board are of the opinion that in these circumstances, any proposal involving sudden or sweeping change would almost certainly tend to excite popular resentment. The other problem was that there was very little financial assistance to help the tenants build new houses. The Board of Supervision pointed out in 1892 that improvements had taken place in those areas where proprietors had supplied their tenants with lime and timber. But when the Lewis District Committee applied to the local government board for funding to improve housing on the island, they were informed that no hope could be held out of a grant from imperial funds for the reconstruction of crofters' houses. In other parts of the Western Isles, local authorities were somewhat more successful in implementing housing reforms. In neighbouring Harris, for example, where similar procedures were undertaken, there was a significant reduction in the number of byre dwellings over a 2-year period. Why then was the Harris District Committee so much more successful? For a start, Harris is much smaller than Lewis and had a correspondingly smaller population of around 5,000 in 1901 as opposed to nearly 30,000 in Lewis. And although there was some overcrowding, it was much less severe in Harris than it was in Lewis. There's also some documentary evidence to suggest that there was a scarcity of cattle in Harris, which meant that there was less need for a combined byre dwelling. By the end of the 19th century then, the majority of houses in Lewis still had no partition between the byre and the living area, no chimney, and no windows in the walls. In 1902, a report on the social condition of the people of Lewis noted that Lewis was the only place left in the Highlands where the byre was routinely cleared out only once a year. Not only that, but unimproved houses were still being built. Tenant opposition to housing improvement in Lewis was expressed by acts of passive resistance rather than active protest. In many cases, tenants simply ignored the required reforms. But we shouldn't see this as simply a casual disregard for authority or a complete opposition to all forms of change. Instead, this was a conscious decision by the tenants to reject specific improvements despite sustained external pressure to reform. In some cases, tenants did implement the required reforms, but a short time later reverted their houses back to their former state. In 1872, for example, crofters in the township of Barabas were made to build improved houses with 2 doors, windows and a partition between the byre and the living area. But it wasn't long before the tenants closed up one of the doors and reverted to using one entrance for both the people and the cattle. Now, there are several possible reasons for this. Firstly, improvements might have been carried out simply in order to acquire the leases that were offered for improved houses. After a suitable period of time had elapsed, a tenant might have felt secure enough to return the house to its unimproved state. Secondly, some tenants may have been genuinely willing to try the new improvements before finding them unsatisfactory and rejecting them. Thirdly, there's documentary evidence to suggest that tenants were willing to make temporary changes simply to placate the estate authorities so that they might be left in peace. There was also significant pressure on tenants from within their own communities. In many cases, whole townships resisted improvement, and this could lead to problems for those who did implement reforms. In one instance, a tenant was persuaded to build a new house to a plan approved by the proprietor. But within 3 months, the tenant had blocked up the windows in the second doorway and was no longer using the chimney. When he was asked about these changes, the tenant first of all stated that he was worried about his cattle, who were now living in the cold and dark. So, he'd inserted a doorway between the 2 ends of the house to give them access to heat and light. He'd also built a central hearth to allow the soot from the fire to escape through the thatch, making it suitable for use as fertiliser. When pressed further, however, he also explained that his neighbours and family, fearing that they too would have to build improved houses, had forced him to revert to a more traditional way of living. But why exactly were the Lewis tenants so resistant to reform? Was this just innate conservatism, as many contemporary commentators claimed, or were there other factors involved? In Lewis, the form and function of the house were key to the tenant's way of life and economy. The Lewis house wasn't simply a shelter or a space for domestic activities. The living quarters accommodated not just the tenants, but also food, fuel and livestock. And it doubled as a workplace for activities such as net making, spinning and threshing grain. Also, the fabric of the house itself was an important source of fertiliser. So the required reforms would have had a significant effect on the tenants' agricultural practices and their way of life. The attempt to segregate sleeping spaces and living spaces was based on middle and upper class values, which saw the practice of living, working, sleeping and cooking in one room as confined to the lower classes, a practice which all civilised people should aim to rise above. But for the Lewis tenants, sleeping close to the fire was preferable to sleeping in a cold room, and few tenants could afford to cut enough peat to maintain a second hearth in the bedroom. The hearth was the centre of the house in many ways. It provided light and warmth for the family and the animals. It was used for cooking, for drying clothes, for curing meat and fish, and it also kept the fabric of the house dry. It was around the fire that the ceilidh was held in the evenings, where neighbours would assemble to sing songs and tell stories and exchange news. In the centre of the room, the hearth would distribute heat evenly around the living area and enable more people to warm themselves around it. The lack of a chimney meant that the smoke would hang in the roof space, helping to extinguish any sparks from the fire, discouraging insects and preventing the growth of fungus on the thatch and on the roof timbers. Smoke was also needed within the house to help prepare the thatch for use as fertiliser. By preventing tenants from removing the thatch and from storing manure in the byre, the estate authorities attempted in one fell swoop to remove two of the most commonly used fertilisers. While such practices were deemed to be unclean and uncivilised and wholly unacceptable, little thought was given to providing tenants with alternative provisions for storing manure or alternative methods of fertilising their land. The introduction of windows and chimneys was seen by the authorities as contributing to more comfortable modes of living, but the tenants' concept of comfort differed radically from that of the landowners. Windows weren't considered necessary and would only have served to weaken that face of the house to the often extreme weather. For the tenants, there was no greater comfort than sitting and socialising around an open central hearth. And there's no definitive evidence that they were any less healthy from living in a house full of peat smoke than they would have been had the hearth been enclosed. The cultural significance of the hearth and its functional attributes were clearly considered more important than living in a smoke-free house. So the tenants' reluctance to change wasn't conservatism for conservatism's sake, but rather a desire to protect their agricultural practices and ways of living. And this idea that Lewis tenants weren't resisting change per se, but only those changes which they perceived to be detrimental, is borne out by the physical and documentary evidence, which suggests that from the mid-19th century onwards, Lewis tenants were in fact making significant changes to their houses. For example, if we look at the physical evidence, it's clear that the mid-19th century houses are larger than their predecessors, and this is most likely related to an increase in family size. We can see that the byre dwelling unit increases in length, as does the porch, but the upper room begins to disappear. By the late 19th century, a smaller proportion of the space within the house was taken up by the cattle, and the doorway had moved from the byre end of the house to a more central location, reflecting the decreasing importance of livestock in the crofting economy. The tenants' way of life was changing. From the mid-19th century, men in Lewis became increasingly reliant on the seasonal herring industry to supplement their livelihood at home. From the 1870s onwards, many young unmarried women joined the menfolk at the fishing, travelling every year as herring gutters and packers to ports such as Wick, Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft. Others went to work in cities, such as Glasgow, as domestic servants. Many tenants also had relatives who had emigrated to Canada and who frequently sent money back home to their families in Lewis. Now, these social changes had two significant effects. Firstly, they increased the disposable income of the average family. Secondly, they allowed the women to see a different way of life than they were used to in Lewis. Different food, different clothes, different shops and different houses. When they returned to the island, they wanted to emulate the way of life they'd seen on the mainland, and they now had the money to do so. Change was very gradual, however, and varied widely across the island, suggesting that the individual needs, desires and needs of the tenants played a significant part in determining the spread of these changes. By the early 20th century, some of the changes which the authorities desired had begun to appear in some Lewis houses, particularly those on the east side of the island, closest to the main town of Stornoway. These included the introduction of one or two small windows and of timber partitions between the byre, the living area and a separate sleeping area at the upper end of the house. From the early 20th century, the authorities' earlier approach of seeking improvement through legislation was replaced by a new focus on education, as public lectures were given on the dangers of using water from contaminated wells, and local nurses advised women on childcare in the home. At the same time, tenants' attitudes and values were beginning to change. Throughout the 20th century, improvements in transport and communications, increased emigration, the islanders' involvement in 2 world wars, and the decline of crop cultivation and cattle rearing all combined to widen the islanders' social and cultural horizons, which in turn influenced their attitudes towards their houses. Women in particular played an important part in the introduction of certain housing changes. The introduction of wallpaper, for example, and the movement and subsequent decoration of the hearth were primarily a result of the women's desire to introduce into the island features that they had seen elsewhere. And as one tenant improved their house, others in the township sought to do the same. It appears then that despite the tenants' reluctance to improve their houses in the manner desired by the authorities, the Lewis tenants were by no means conservative in their attitudes towards their houses. Instead, they were willing to implement changes that they perceived to be of some value, while rejecting those which they didn't consider to be improvements. The changes that they implemented on their own terms reflected their own changing social and cultural values, as well as the changing rural economies. So, as we've seen, a key element of the 19th century agenda for reform was the introduction of various kinds of segregation. The physical segregation of people from animals, of different working and domestic activities, and of the sexes expressed values that were important in the society and culture of landowners and reformers at the time. But these values were significantly less important in tenant society, particularly in rural areas. Where landowners attempted to encourage tenants to improve their houses, this was often done with a lack of understanding and care for the tenants' needs, wishes and way of life. In 1884, the Crofters Commission had recognised that improvements to tenant housing wouldn't be successfully attained by, as they put it, precipitate and imperative legislation, but instead by mutual assistance, keeping in view the resources at the disposal of the proprietor and the means, the habits and the desires of the tenant. In Lewis, however, a succession of proprietors and, later, local authorities used the blunt instrument of regulation to attempt improvements with very little attention given to the means, the habits and the desires of the tenants. Within the house, the proposed reforms attempted to separate the tenants' domestic arrangements from their livelihoods, when in fact the two were profoundly and intimately connected. Without the produce from the land and the sea, the tenants would have no form of subsistence. The traditional agricultural ways were known and trusted by the tenants, and the attempted reforms offered no immediate economic alternative. In reality, many of the desired improvements to tenant housing could not have been successfully introduced in Lewis until the agricultural practices had changed, such that the cattle were no longer of primary importance, the thatch was no longer needed for fertiliser, and perhaps most crucially, the society and culture of the people had adapted to new ways of living and working on the croft. The example of Lewis is important because it represents the clearest and most sustained example of resistance to housing reform in Britain. The buyer dwelling tradition persisted longer in Lewis than it did anywhere else in Britain and Ireland, and a few examples could still be found on the island in the 1960s. But Lewis was by no means unique. During the 19th century, many landowners and local authorities across Britain and Ireland attempted to improve the social and moral condition of their tenants by encouraging improved housing. As in Lewis, they frequently met with limited success. While legislation allowed for the removal of unsanitary dwellings, there was an understandable reluctance to demolish substandard houses when there was no provision for new accommodation. Ultimately, it would take 20th century intervention by the state in order to build enough houses for the working classes, both rural and urban. But the lack of success of housing reform was also the result of a high-handed approach by landowners and authorities who believed utterly in the superiority of their own ways and values while paying little attention to those of their tenants. The experiences of the Lewis tenants during the 19th century are well reflected in this quote. closely interwoven with nature and its cyclical rhythm, our way of life was certainly different, but not inferior. Our relatively harmonious coexistence with nature was interpreted as a sign of backwardness and primitiveness. Development was measured in terms of the distance between humans and nature. The greater the distance between the two, the higher the level of development. The principles of development denigrated traditional behaviours. Those who disregarded these principles were labelled irrational. But in fact, that quote wasn't written in the 19th century, and it wasn't written about social reform in the Scottish Hebrides. It was written by Nepalese scholar Nanda Shrestha about his own country's colonial experiences in the 1950s. But the comparison is striking. The example that I've discussed with you here this evening is firmly embedded in the past, but it's worth remembering that these same issues are very much alive in many parts of the world today. In Manila, for example, the authorities continue to battle with slum dwellers who are reluctant to leave their homes and move to improved, purpose-built settlements outside the city. In many cases, these new settlements are wholly unsuited to the people's way of life. And if you're to take away two key messages from my talk this evening, I'd like it to be these. First of all, people have a very complex relationship with their homes, and this relationship is firmly based in a particular set of cultural norms and values that support their particular way of life and economy. And therefore, what's appropriate in one community might not be appropriate in another. And secondly, changes to the built environment must take into account the perspectives of those whose lives will be most affected by them. Ultimately, changes will only be successful if they meet people's social and cultural needs, desires, and values. If they don't, particularly within the home environment, then we can expect such changes to be resisted. Thank you.